My name is Elijah Castillo, Railroad Inspector for Union Pacific. I survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When the blue storms hit and temperatures plummeted, my knowledge of rail lines kept me alive while cities became frozen graveyards. This is how I found shelter, gathered survivors, and fought to reach the only place still warm enough for humanity to survive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never thought I'd be making a recording like this. My name is Elijah Castillo. Most people called me Dust. I worked as a track inspector for Union Pacific Railroad. 12 years walking the rails across the American Southwest, making sure the tracks that connected our country stayed intact. Now I'm recording this because someone needs to document what happened, how fast it all changed, how the world froze over. It started 30 days ago. I was working a remote section of track about 40 miles northeast of Taos, New Mexico. Just another routine inspection. The weather had been unusual for weeks, colder than normal for October, but nothing that rang alarm bells. At least not for me. Looking back, there were signs I should have noticed. The unusual cargo manifests showing emergency supplies being rushed north. Military transport requests given priority clearance on our lines. The way animals seemed to be migrating south weeks ahead of schedule. That morning started normal enough. Cold, but manageable. I remember checking my phone during my lunch break, scrolling past news alerts about atmospheric anomalies and polar vortex destabilization. Just weather jargon that meant nothing to a guy who spent his days checking rail ties and gauges. I dismissed it, finished my sandwich, and got back to work. Around 2 in the afternoon, I noticed a strange color on the horizon. Not the normal gray of storm clouds, but a sickening electric blue that seemed to pulse. Within an hour, that blue wall was overhead, and the temperature dropped like someone had opened a door to deep space. 30 degrees in 30 minutes. My digital thermometer malfunctioned, just couldn't handle the rapid change. The radio started picking up fragments of emergency broadcasts, but the signals were breaking up. I knew I was in trouble. The maintenance truck I was driving wasn't designed for extreme conditions, and I was miles from anywhere that could qualify as shelter. The maintenance outpost near Taos was my only option. A small facility with basic supplies, backup generator, and most importantly, insulated walls and a wood stove. The drive there was like something from a nightmare. The temperature kept dropping so fast I could see the gauge moving. Roads were already icing over as moisture in the air froze instantly. I passed 3 cars in ditches, their occupants struggling in clothing completely inadequate for what was happening. I stopped for the first one, a family with 2 kids. Their car had slid off the road and they were already showing signs of hypothermia. Got them into my truck, blasting what heat I could, but the vents were blowing colder by the minute as the engine struggled against temperatures it wasn't built for. We made it to the outpost just as the first real snow began. Thick, heavy flakes that accumulated inches in minutes, not hours. I got the family inside, fired up the generator, and lit the wood stove while trying to reach dispatch on the radio. The last communication I got through was broken and panicked. Regional headquarters in Albuquerque was evacuating. The words that came through clearest were nationwide and stay put. That first night we huddled around the stove while the wind outside howled like something wounded. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero in northern New Mexico in October. By morning, the snow was 3 feet deep and still coming down. The family I'd picked up, the Morales family, were shell-shocked but alive. Mr. Morales had been driving them from Denver to his parents' home in Santa Fe. He kept saying they should continue on, that his parents would be worried. I had to show him the drift against the door, already 5 feet high, to convince him no one was going anywhere. Days 2 and 3 were spent taking inventory, and trying to make contact with anyone outside. The outpost wasn't meant for long-term habitation, but as railroad emergency shelters go, it was better stocked than most. Emergency rations for about 2 weeks if we were careful. First aid supplies, tools, maintenance equipment. Most importantly, a good supply of firewood and coal for the stove. The generator was running, but I was rationing fuel, only using it for a few hours each day to preserve our supply. The radio picked up nothing but static. Cell networks were down completely. The only information we had was from an emergency weather radio that occasionally caught automated broadcasts. That's when we first heard the term Rapid Onset Global Cooling Event. Scientists were scrambling to explain how temperatures across the northern hemisphere had plummeted so dramatically, so quickly. Theories about methane releases from melting permafrost triggering a cascade effect. Talk of altered ocean currents. None of it mattered to us. What mattered was the final message that kept repeating, "Shelter in place, conserve heat and food, help is coming." By day 3, when the thermometer showed -40 and still dropping, I knew this wasn't just a freak storm. This was something else entirely. Something historic and catastrophic. The Morales family was coming to the same realization, their faces growing more solemn with each passing hour. Day 4 brought a brief break in the snowfall, and our first visitors, a county snowplow operator named Frank, who had abandoned his useless vehicle and followed the rail line to our location. He brought the first real news from outside. Santa Fe was in chaos. The power grid had failed almost immediately. People were freezing in their homes. The highways were littered with abandoned cars, many with bodies still inside. The National Guard had tried to establish warming centers in public buildings, but without power or adequate fuel, they were fighting a losing battle. Frank's arrival changed our calculations. Another mouth to feed, but also another pair of hands and, crucially, more information. He confirmed what the automated broadcasts had suggested. This wasn't localized. Reports before communications failed completely suggested the entire northern hemisphere was experiencing the same dramatic cooling. Places accustomed to winter weather were faring slightly better, but nowhere was prepared for how quickly it happened. By the end of the first week, the power grid completely failed. We'd been expecting it, conserving the generator fuel and relying mostly on the wood stove, but the darkness that fell that night felt different, more permanent somehow. I stood at the window looking out at a world transformed. The moonlight reflected off the snow created an eerie blue glow over landscape buried under at least 6 feet of accumulation. In that moment, I realized we weren't waiting out a storm. We were witnessing the birth of a new ice age. That same night, we heard knocking at the door. 2 more railroad workers, Martin and Sophie, had followed the tracks from a derailed train about 10 miles south. They'd been part of a crew shipping cattle from Texas, and when the blue storm hit, their train had lost power on an incline and slid backward into a gully. They were the only survivors from a crew of 5, making their way through the snow by following the raised rail bed. As we huddled around the stove that night, Martin told us about Santa Fe. They'd passed through on their way north before taking to the rail lines. It wasn't a city anymore, he said, his voice hollow, just a frozen graveyard. That was when I first understood we were on our own. No help was coming. If we were going to survive, it would be up to us. With Martin and Sophie's arrival, our little group grew to 6 people in a space designed for maybe 3 workers at most. The maintenance outpost wasn't large. A main room with the wood stove, a small kitchenette, a supply closet, and a tiny bathroom. We set up sleeping arrangements on the floor around the stove, taking turns feeding it through the night to keep the temperature survivable. Days 4 through 7 were about establishing routines. The Morales family, Miguel, his wife Lucia, and their children Elena and Daniel, took charge of rationing our food supplies. Martin, who had been a railroad engineer for 15 years, helped me assess exactly what we had to work with in terms of equipment. Sophie, who'd been a conductor but had emergency medical training, inventoried our first aid supplies and checked everyone for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Frank, the snowplow operator, turned out to be handy with tools and immediately started figuring out ways to better insulate our windows and doors. I kept thinking help would come eventually, some kind of organized response. But as each day passed with temperatures remaining below -30, that hope faded. We tried the radio several times daily, but picked up nothing but automated emergency broadcasts repeating the same useless instructions. Stay inside, conserve heat, wait for assistance. On day 5, I decided we needed to know exactly what we had and how long it would last. The results weren't encouraging. Food for maybe 2 weeks if we stretched it thin. Fuel for the generator to last about the same if used sparingly. Firewood and coal for perhaps 3 weeks of continuous burning. Medical supplies were adequate for minor injuries, but nothing serious. We had 7 gallons of drinking water plus snow we could melt, the only resource that wasn't limited. We need to think longer term, I told the others that night. This isn't going to blow over in a few days. Martin nodded grimly. I saw the railroad emergency protocols for extreme weather events. They never planned for anything lasting more than 2 weeks. So what do we do? Miguel asked, his arm around his wife. Try to reach a larger town. I shook my head. From what Frank and Martin have seen, larger population centers are worse off. More people competing for fewer resources. And traveling in these conditions would be suicide. So we're just stuck here? Lucia's voice had an edge of panic. Not stuck, I corrected. Safe, for now, and we have advantages others don't. I pulled out the railroad maps I kept in my work bag, detailed schematics showing not just the main lines, but maintenance access points, storage facilities, and utility buildings scattered across the region. Places most people wouldn't know about or be able to find, especially now with roads buried and landmarks obscured by snow. The railroad built contingencies into the system, I explained. Storage depots with tools, emergency supplies, even food in some cases. And they're all connected by the rail lines, paths that are elevated above the surrounding terrain and easier to follow than roads right now. That night we developed our first real plan. We would stay put, make our supplies last as long as possible, and use the maintenance outpost as our base of operations. If we needed to venture out for additional supplies, we would follow the rail lines to known facilities where we might find what we needed. Day 6 brought new challenges. The temperature outside dropped to -50 during the night. Even with the stove burning continuously, the temperature inside the outpost hovered just above freezing. We wore every layer of clothing we had, wrapped ourselves in emergency blankets from the first aid kit, and still the cold seemed to seep into our bones. That morning, Daniel, the Morales' 6-year-old son, developed a cough. Sophie examined him with concern in her eyes but tried to keep her voice calm. It's probably just from the dry air and cold, she said, but we need to keep him warm and hydrated. We focused on improving our shelter. Frank figured out how to block the bathroom and supply closet vents, redirecting what little heat we had to the main room. Martin and I disassembled some of the metal storage cabinets and used the sheets of metal to create reflectors behind the stove, directing more heat into the room rather than letting it escape up the chimney. Miguel fashioned extra insulation for the windows using maintenance manuals and paperwork layered between frames. On the morning of day 7, we woke to absolute silence. The constant howl of wind that had been our background noise for days had stopped. The generator, which we'd been running for a few hours each evening, sputtered and died despite having fuel. When I went to the window and cleared the frost, I understood why. The temperature had dropped so low overnight that the world outside seemed frozen in place. No wind, no movement, just crystal clear air so cold it hurt to breathe when I cracked the door. The thermometer read -65. Later, we would learn this had been the pattern across much of North America. The initial storm, followed by a temperature drop so severe, it created an eerie, deadly stillness. That same day, we lost power completely. The grid, which had been fluctuating for days, finally went dark for good. Our generator, not designed for such extreme cold, refused to start no matter what we tried. We were now entirely dependent on the wood stove for heat and light. In that new darkness, lit only by the glow of the stove and a few emergency lanterns, we had our first real argument. Frank wanted to try reaching Taos, convinced that a larger town would have better supplies and shelter. Miguel sided with him, worried about his son's worsening cough. Martin, Sophie, and I maintained that staying put was our only viable option. "You don't understand what it's like out there," Martin said, his voice rising. "I watched people freeze to death trying to walk less than a mile. The cold is like nothing you've ever experienced. It doesn't just chill you, it burns. Your lungs feel like they're on fire with each breath. Your eyes freeze. Exposed skin dies in minutes, not hours." The argument might have continued, but a sound from outside stopped us all cold. A metallic tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone was outside, following the railroad tracks, hitting the rail with something metal as they walked. An old railroad signal method I recognized from my training. We fell silent, listening to the approaching taps. Friend or foe? In a world suddenly reduced to the most basic elements of survival, it was impossible to know. I grabbed a heavy wrench, the closest thing we had to a weapon, and moved toward the door, the others falling back toward the stove. The tapping stopped just outside our building. Then came a knock, weak but distinct. I exchanged glances with the others, then cautiously approached the door, wrench raised. When I pulled it open, a blast of Arctic air swept in along with a figure so bundled in layers of clothing they were barely recognizable as human. They stumbled forward, collapsing onto our floor in a heap of frost-covered fabric. Sophie rushed forward, helping me unwrap the layers of scarves and coats from the figure's face. Beneath it all was a woman, maybe mid-30s, her exposed skin showing patchy white spots of frostbite across her cheeks and nose. Her eyes were red-rimmed and watery, her breathing labored. "Railroad," she managed to gasp. "Followed the tracks, saw your smoke." As Sophie began treating her frostbite, the woman, who eventually told us her name was Rebecca, shared fragments of information between painful breaths. She had been part of a research team at a climate monitoring station about 15 miles away. When the blue storm hit, their facility lost power almost immediately. Most of the team had tried to reach Taos by road and never returned. She had stayed behind with one colleague, an older man who died 3 days ago when they ran out of fuel for heat. Rebecca confirmed what we'd pieced together ourselves. This wasn't a temporary storm, but a catastrophic climate event unlike anything recorded in human history. And from what she'd seen on her journey to find help, society was crumbling under its impact. No electricity, no communications, no transportation, just isolated pockets of survivors fighting against cold that the human body simply wasn't designed to endure. By the end of that first week, our group had grown to 7. Our supplies were dwindling faster than planned, and any illusions about temporary disruption had frozen solid in the reality of our new world. We weren't waiting for rescue anymore. We were planning how to survive what increasingly looked like a new ice age. Rebecca's arrival changed our dynamic. As a climate scientist, she understood what was happening better than any of us. Once Sophie had treated her frostbite and she'd warmed up enough to speak clearly, She explained the theories her research team had been tracking before communications went down. It's a cascading failure of multiple climate systems, she told us as we huddled around the stove on day 8. The warming we'd been experiencing for decades weakened the jet stream that normally keeps Arctic air contained. When it finally broke down, it released centuries of accumulated cold all at once. The blue coloration in the storms comes from ice crystals so dense they scatter light differently than normal clouds. Will it get better? Elena, the Morales' 10-year-old daughter, asked. Rebecca hesitated, then spoke carefully. Not quickly. The models we were running suggested that once this kind of rapid cooling begins, it creates feedback loops that accelerate and sustain it. The increased snow cover reflects more sunlight back into space, which causes more cooling, which creates more snow. How long? Miguel pressed. Years, Rebecca said quietly. Possibly decades. Maybe longer. That night, after the children were asleep, we adults had a frank discussion about our situation. With 7 people, our supplies wouldn't last even 2 weeks. The cold showed no signs of abating. Daniel's cough was getting worse despite Sophie's care. We needed a new strategy. I proposed using the railroad as our lifeline. The tracks are our path in this new world, I explained, tracing routes on my maps. They're elevated, which makes them easier to navigate in deep snow. They connect to facilities most people won't know about or be able to find, and I know exactly where every maintenance shed, storage depot, and service building is located within a 100-mile radius. Martin backed me up. Railroad infrastructure was built to withstand extreme conditions. The buildings are sturdy, often with backup generators, emergency supplies, and tools. If we can reach them, we might find what we need to survive longer. The next morning, day 9, I worked with Martin to establish a signal system along the nearby tracks. We used metal reflectors from the emergency kits, arranging them in patterns that would catch the eye of anyone following the rail line. We cleared snow from a section of track and used coal to darken it, creating a visual marker visible from a distance. It was dangerous work. Even bundled in every layer we had, we could only stay outside for 20 minutes at a time before the cold became life-threatening. While we worked on the signals, Frank and Miguel converted some of the maintenance equipment into tools better suited for our new reality. They took apart a track inspection cart, using its metal frame to create a sled that could haul supplies through deep snow. They fashioned snowshoes from spare parts and wire mesh, crude but functional. Inside, Sophie and Lucia worked with Rebecca to improve our living conditions. They created a separate sleeping area for Daniel, positioning him closest to the stove to help with his cough. They developed a system for melting snow efficiently for drinking water and minimal washing. Rebecca, despite her injuries, cataloged our remaining supplies with scientific precision, calculating exactly how long we could survive on what we had. That night, we had our first serious disagreement about resources. Frank noticed that Daniel was receiving extra food portions and raised concerns about fairness. We all need to eat the same to survive, he argued. We can't play favorites. He's a child with a respiratory infection, Sophie countered. His body needs more calories to fight it off. And what happens when we run out of food 3 days earlier because of it? Frank pressed. We all die, including him. I found myself stepping into a leadership role I hadn't asked for. We're not going to let anyone starve, I said firmly. But we're also not going to survive if we don't work together. Tomorrow, we start executing our plan to find more supplies. The tension remained, but we had a direction at least. On day 10, Martin and I prepared for our first resource expedition. The target was a storage depot about 5 miles down the track, where maintenance materials and potentially emergency supplies would be stored. We gathered the makeshift sled, tools that could double as weapons if needed, emergency blankets, and a small amount of food and water. The preparations were meticulous because we all understood the stakes. At these temperatures, a minor mistake could be fatal. We layered clothing carefully to avoid sweating, which could freeze and cause hypothermia. We covered every inch of skin and devised a buddy system where we would check each other for signs of frostbite every 15 minutes. As we prepared to leave at first light, Rebecca pulled me aside. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Before our communications went down completely, we received reports of violence in larger settlements. The cold is bringing out the worst in some people. Be careful out there." Martin and I set out just as dawn broke over a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The world had become a monochrome wasteland, wind-swept snow sculpted into alien formations, trees shattered by the extreme cold, their limbs lying on the snow like fallen soldiers. The only consistent path was the raised railroad bed, now a lifeline cutting through the white expanse. The journey that should have taken less than 2 hours in normal conditions became an epic struggle. The cold was a physical presence, pushing against us with every step. We pulled the sled in shifts, following the tracks that were sometimes buried under drifts so deep we had to dig to make sure we were still on the right path. About 3 miles in, we saw our first evidence of other survivors. Footprints following the rail line, partially filled with fresh snow but still visible. Multiple people moving south. We approached more cautiously after that, aware that in this new world, other humans could be either allies or threats. The storage depot appeared through the swirling snow around midday, a rectangular concrete building nestled against the rail line. The door was secured with a standard railroad lock, which I had keys for as part of my inspector role. Inside was dark and just as cold as outside, but protected from the wind. We swept our emergency lanterns around the space, revealing shelves of tools, maintenance equipment, and, most precious of all, a stash of emergency rations, blankets, and a small propane heater with several canisters of fuel. We were methodically loading our sled when the depot door swung open. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the snow glare, their faces obscured by scarves and frost-covered balaclavas. Each carried an improvised weapon, a pipe, a large wrench, a hunting knife. "That's railroad property you're taking," the tallest one said, his voice muffled by his face covering. Martin and I exchanged glances, both reaching slowly for the tools we'd brought as potential weapons. "We're railroad employees," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I'm a track inspector. This is emergency access." The figures stepped inside, closing the door behind them. "Railroad doesn't exist anymore," the one with the knife said. "Nothing exists anymore, except what you can take and hold." I recognized the desperate logic of survivors pushed to extremes. These weren't bad people necessarily, just people making hard choices in impossible circumstances. I slowly pulled out my railroad ID, still in my pocket out of habit more than any expectation it would matter. "We're all trying to survive here," I said. "There's enough for all of us if we work together." A tense standoff followed, neither side willing to back down but neither eager to initiate violence that would benefit no one. Finally, I proposed a solution. We would share the supplies equally between our groups, and I would show them on my maps where other railroad facilities with potential resources could be found. To my surprise, they agreed. The man with the pipe lowered his weapon first. "We were station workers from Santa Fe," he explained as we divided the supplies. "Got out just before the worst hit. Been following the tracks north looking for anything we could use." "North?" Martin questioned. "Shouldn't you be heading south, away from the cold?" "South is chaos," the knife wielder said grimly. "Too many people. Not enough supplies. Saw things on the way out of Santa Fe I wish I could forget." They shared what information they had as we worked. Confirmation that larger towns were experiencing complete breakdowns in civil order, that military presence was minimal and overwhelmed, that the cold was, if anything, Worse further south, despite what logic would suggest. We parted on neutral terms, our sled loaded with half the depot's supplies, enough to significantly extend our outpost's viability, and new information that would shape our plans going forward. The return journey was grueling but faster, with a clear path already broken through the snow. When we arrived back at the outpost that evening, hauling our precious cargo, the reception was mixed. Relief at the supplies, certainly, but also concern about the others we'd encountered. The idea that we might have to defend what we had against desperate survivors hadn't fully registered until that moment. That night, as everyone inspected the new supplies with the excitement of people who had been staring death in the face, I found myself standing by the window, watching the endless snow and thinking about what came next. Our outpost was becoming more than just a temporary shelter. It was becoming a fragile community, and whether I liked it or not, I was now responsible for its survival. The supplies from the storage depot bought us precious time, but we knew it was temporary. On days 11 and 12, we focused on preparing for a more ambitious expedition. Our encounter with the Santa Fe survivors had reinforced both the dangers and opportunities of venturing further from our base. "We need to be more strategic," I told the group as we inventoried what we'd brought back. The propane heater was particularly valuable, providing a backup heat source that didn't consume our dwindling wood and coal supplies. The extra blankets and cold weather gear meant we could better equip anyone going outside. The emergency rations extended our food supply by nearly a week. Martin studied my railroad maps, identifying potential targets. "This service building here." He pointed to a location about 12 miles southwest along the main line. "It's a crew change facility, larger than a typical maintenance outpost. Might have more substantial supplies, maybe even a bigger generator." Rebecca added her expertise, reviewing weather patterns she'd observed. "The winds have been predominantly from the northwest. If that holds, traveling southwest means we'd have the wind at our backs at least one way." We selected our team carefully. Martin and I had proven we could handle the conditions, so we would go again. Miguel volunteered as well, partly out of a desire to contribute, partly to escape the cramped conditions of the outpost where his son's constant coughing was a reminder of their precarious situation. The preparations were even more thorough this time. Sophie took apart one of the thermal blankets and figured out how to incorporate the reflective material into our outermost layers, creating better insulation. Frank modified the sled design based on our experience, making it lighter and adding ski-like runners that glided better over packed snow. We prepared 3 days' worth of supplies, acknowledging that the journey might take longer than expected. The night before our departure, I couldn't sleep. The responsibility weighed heavily. If something happened to us out there, the others would be left with limited options. If we brought back nothing, our collective situation would become dire within weeks. I spent hours memorizing the route, alternative paths, potential shelter points along the way in case we needed to hole up during the journey. Day 11 dawned clear and brutally cold. The temperature had stabilized around -45, still lethal within minutes of exposure but consistent enough that we could plan around it. We set out just after sunrise, a 3-man team pulling a reinforced sled through a world of white. The going was slower than our previous expedition. The wind had created massive drifts across the tracks in several places, forcing us to dig our way through or find routes around. By midday, we'd covered only about 5 miles, less than half our intended distance. We passed eerie reminders of how quickly civilization had collapsed. An abandoned snowmobile, its fuel lines frozen and cracked, its rider nowhere to be seen. A small cabin near the tracks, door open, interior ransacked. A dark stain in the snow outside that none of us commented on. The skeletal remains of power transmission towers that had buckled under the weight of ice, lying across the landscape like fallen giants. As the short winter day began to fade, we faced a difficult decision: push on in darkness, risking hypothermia and disorientation, or find shelter and continue in the morning. We chose shelter, spotting a small track maintenance shed about half a mile ahead. The shed wasn't designed for human habitation, just equipment storage, but its walls blocked the wind and its metal roof kept out the snow. We used the propane heater sparingly, just enough to keep us from freezing solid during the night. None of us slept well, taking turns staying awake to maintain the heater and watch for any signs of other travelers. I used the quiet night hours to reflect on how completely my life had transformed in less than 2 weeks. From a solitary track inspector concerned with gauges and bolts to someone responsible for the survival of a growing community. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd chosen railroad work partly because it let me avoid exactly this kind of human entanglement. Dawn of day 12 brought renewal of our journey. The crew change facility appeared through the snow haze around 11 in the morning, a low, sprawling building alongside a rail siding where crews would once transfer between trains during long hauls. We approached cautiously, looking for signs of occupancy or recent activity. The building showed no external damage, and no footprints disturbed the snow around it. Promising signs. I used my master key to access the main entrance, and we slipped inside, weapons ready just in case. What we found exceeded our cautious hopes. The facility had been occupied recently by railroad staff who had apparently departed in an organized fashion. The place was clean, intact, and, most importantly, stocked with supplies. A large diesel generator in the basement, cabinets full of non-perishable food, a medical room with prescription medications and equipment, clothing, blankets, tools, a communications room with shortwave radios, though none functioning in the current conditions. "We hit the jackpot," Miguel whispered, his voice reverential as we moved through the building. "Don't celebrate yet," Martin cautioned. "We still have to get this back." We worked methodically, cataloging everything and prioritizing what to take first. The medicine for Daniel's cough, the food, fuel for the generator back at our outpost, cold weather gear. We could make multiple trips if necessary, but the first haul needed to include the most critical supplies. As we loaded our sled, the first complication arose. The weight of the supplies we wanted to take far exceeded what 3 men could pull through deep snow over 12 miles. We needed to be selective or find another solution. The second complication arrived just as we were finalizing our load. Voices outside. Multiple people approaching along the tracks. We moved quickly to defensive positions, unsure whether to expect friends or foes. 4 figures entered, bundled against the cold but moving with purpose. Their reaction to seeing us was immediate, raising makeshift weapons and spreading out to block the exit. Unlike our previous encounter with survivors, these people moved with coordination that suggested military or law enforcement training. "Railroad security," the lead figure announced, lowering his scarf to reveal a bearded face with sharp eyes. "This facility is under our protection." I stepped forward, slowly, hands visible. "I'm Elijah Castillo, Union Pacific Track Inspector. We're just looking for supplies to help our people survive." The leader studied my face, then nodded slightly. Jeff Browning, New Mexico State Police. Was police anyway. He gestured for his companions to lower their weapons. "We've been establishing secure points along the rail line. This is one of them." The tension eased but didn't disappear entirely. They weren't hostile, but they were clearly protective of what they'd claimed. We explained our situation, the outpost, our growing group of survivors, Daniel's illness. Browning conferred with his team, then made us an offer. "We need people with railroad knowledge. You know, the infrastructure, the locations of supplies, how to maintain the tracks. We're trying to establish a cooperative network between survivor groups using the rail lines as connectors. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Share resources. Share information. We help each other. You take what you need today, but you join our network. Mark your outpost on our maps. Agree to help others we send your way. Contribute to maintaining the rail lines as a transportation route. It was the first hint I'd seen of organized response to the disaster, not from government or official channels, but from people with skills creating new systems from the remnants of the old. It offered both hope and complications. Joining meant obligation, visibility, potential vulnerability. Refusing meant isolation and limited resources. After brief discussion, we accepted their proposal. The Alliance gave us access to far more supplies than we could have transported ourselves. They even provided an escort of one person to help us haul the sled back and to formally add our outpost to their network map. The return journey was still grueling, but faster with the extra person and with a broken trail to follow. By evening of the same day, we arrived back at the outpost with our bounty and our news of the broader network forming along the rail lines. Our reception was mixed. Relief at the supplies, especially the medicine for Daniel. Excitement at the prospect of being part of something larger than our isolated group. But also concern about the implications of joining a network we knew little about. As I watched the others sort through our new supplies, I contemplated what this development meant. The rail lines that had been my career were now becoming lifelines in a more literal sense than I could have imagined. Physical connections between islands of humanity in a frozen sea. Whether this nascent network would become the foundation of rebuilding or collapse under the weight of human conflict remained to be seen. But for the first time since the Blue Storm, I felt something beyond mere survival was possible. Days 13 through 16 transformed our outpost from a place of desperate survival to something resembling a functional community. Browning's escort, a former Army Corps of Engineers sergeant named Diane, stayed with us for 2 days, helping us organize our expanded supplies and teaching us communication protocols for the network she was part of. We mark safe locations with a specific pattern, she explained, showing us how to arrange reflective markers along the tracks. 3 reflectors in a triangle means supplies available. A vertical line means medical help. An X means danger. Stay away. The medicine for Daniel quickly improved his condition. Sophie administered the pediatric antibiotics we'd recovered, and within 48 hours his fever broke and the cough began to loosen. Lucia's relief was visible, the constant worry lines on her forehead softening for the first time since they'd arrived. With our immediate survival less precarious, more survivors began finding their way to us. On day 13, 2 college students arrived, Zach and Ava, who had been hiking the mountains when the Blue Storm hit and had survived by sheltering in a fire lookout tower until their food ran out. They'd spotted our signal markers and followed them to our door. Day 14 brought an elderly man named Henry, a retired electrical engineer who had been living alone in a cabin about 5 miles from the rail line. When his generator failed, he'd made the desperate trek to find help, nearly dying in the process. His frostbite was severe, but Sophie managed to save most of his fingers and toes. With each new arrival came new skills. Zach had worked summers as a wilderness guide and knew trapping techniques that might help us supplement our food supplies. Ava was studying environmental engineering and immediately began working with Rebecca on water collection and filtration systems. Henry's electrical knowledge proved invaluable as we worked to maximize the efficiency of our generator and repair various equipment. By day 16, our group had grown to 11 people in a space designed for maybe 3 or 4. We converted the supply closet into a medical area where Sophie could treat Henry's frostbite and monitor Daniel's recovery. The main room became our communal living and sleeping space, with shifts established so that people could stretch out during their rest periods. The small bathroom was on a strict schedule. It wasn't comfortable, but it was organized. With our basic needs addressed, I could turn attention to establishing our place in the emerging network. Using parts from railroad communication equipment, Henry and I constructed a rudimentary radio receiver. We couldn't transmit, but we could pick up stronger signals if they were broadcasting nearby. Late on day 16, we caught our first broadcast, fragmented and static-filled, but unmistakably human. A military transmission discussing evacuation points and supply drops, most of which had clearly already happened or failed. Then, something that made us all go silent. Mention of secure zones being established along the southern border using geothermal energy for heat and power. The message cut out before we could get details, but it confirmed something critical. Organized human activity was continuing somewhere. The government, military, or some combination hadn't completely collapsed. And most importantly, there were places where the cold was being successfully fought back. That night, around the stove, we had our first community meeting that wasn't just about immediate survival. We were becoming something more than refugees. We were becoming a functioning unit with plans beyond the next meal or the next day. "We need rules," Frank said, voicing what several had been thinking. "Clear expectations about contributions, resource sharing, decision-making." Miguel nodded. "And we need to formalize our relationship with this network. Are we just a waypoint, or are we actively participating?" The discussion continued for hours, sometimes heated, but never breaking down. We established work rotations for essential tasks, maintaining heat, preparing food, monitoring the radio, standing watch. We created inventory systems to track our supplies. We even established a crude voting mechanism for major decisions, with me acting as tiebreaker if necessary. I found myself in a leadership position I'd never sought and wasn't sure I wanted. Railroad inspection had appealed to me partly because it was solitary work with clear parameters. Now I was responsible for balancing the needs, opinions, and emotions of nearly a dozen people in life or death circumstances. As we developed our internal systems, we also strengthened our connections to the emerging rail network. 2 days after Diane left, another messenger arrived, a former railroad security officer named Paul, who was traveling between outposts like ours, sharing information and coordinating efforts. Paul brought maps showing other survivor communities along a 100-mile stretch of track. Some were as small as ours, others considerably larger. Some had specialized resources. One had a doctor. Another had managed to salvage significant fuel supplies. A third had a working short-range radio transmitter. "We're trying to establish regular courier routes between locations," Paul explained. "Eventually, if we can clear enough track, we might even get some manual inspection carts running. Real transport." The idea was ambitious, but not impossible. Railroad tracks were designed to withstand extreme conditions, and much of the network remained physically intact despite the catastrophic cooling. If we could establish connections between isolated survivor communities, we might create something that could endure. Paul stayed only one night before continuing his route, but his visit left us with new purpose. We were part of something larger, a collaborative effort to maintain what threads of civilization we could in a world coming apart at the seams. Not everyone was comfortable with this more visible role, however. The more our outpost became known as a waypoint in the network, the more attention we attracted. Not all of it welcome. Frank, in particular, raised concerns about security. The more visible our success becomes, the more attention we'll attract from those who'd rather take than trade, he warned during one evening discussion. We need to think about defense. It was a valid concern that none of us had good answers for. We had tools that could serve as weapons in a pinch, but nothing designed for fighting. None of us except Diane had military or law enforcement training. Our outpost wasn't designed to be defended. It was a maintenance building with thin walls and multiple points of entry. As if to validate Frank's concerns, that night we heard voices outside. Multiple people moving along the tracks after dark. We extinguished all but one small light and positioned ourselves strategically around the main room, makeshift weapons in hand. The voices passed without approaching our door, but the incident left everyone on edge. The next morning, I made a decision. We need better security and more information about what's happening beyond our immediate area. I'm going to make contact with Browning's group again, see what they can tell us about the broader situation. Miguel and Zach volunteered to accompany me. We prepared for a one-day round trip to the crew change facility where we'd first encountered Browning's people, hoping to find them still there, or at least evidence of where they'd gone. As we gathered supplies for the journey, Rebecca pulled me aside. "There's something else you should consider while you're out there," she said quietly. "The cold is stabilizing. It's still lethal, but the dramatic drops have stopped. We might be reaching a new equilibrium. If that's true, we need to start thinking longer term, not just about surviving the next month, but about surviving years in these conditions." Her words stayed with me as we prepared to depart. The frozen world outside had begun to feel almost normal in its terrible way. The constant cold, the endless snow, the struggle for basic necessities. But Rebecca was right. If this was not a temporary disaster but a new climate reality, everything changed. Our strategies, our goals, our very concept of what survival meant. The outpost had become more than a shelter. It had become a community, a node in a network, perhaps even the beginning of something that could outlast us. As I looked around at the people busily working, checking supplies, maintaining equipment, caring for each other, I realized that despite everything, we had created something valuable from the ruins of our former world. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. Our trip to reconnect with Browning's group had to be postponed. On day 17, a new reality set in. We were completely snowed in. Overnight, a massive storm had dumped nearly 4 feet of new snow, burying our outpost up to the windows. The door could barely be forced open against the weight, and when Frank managed to push through enough to look outside, there was nothing to see but white in every direction. We were trapped, at least until we could dig out. This created a new kind of tension. 11 people confined in a space meant for 3 or 4, with no possibility of even brief escapes outside for fresh air or privacy. You don't realize how important those small breaks are until they're gone. The psychological strain appeared almost immediately. Small irritations that would normally be brushed off became sources of conflict. Lucia and Miguel had a heated argument about rationing juice for the children. Frank and Henry clashed over generator usage. Even Sophie, usually the peacemaker, snapped at Ava over space in the medical corner. I found myself constantly mediating, pulling people aside for private conversations, trying to maintain some semblance of order. By the evening of day 17, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Leading people, I discovered, drained something deeper than muscle energy. "We need a project," Rebecca suggested as we tried to fall asleep that night, everyone arranged in tight rows around the stove. Something to focus collective energy and give people purpose. She was right. The next morning, I proposed a major reorganization of our space. We would convert the main room into distinct zones: sleeping, food preparation, work and repair, medical. We would build shelving from spare materials to maximize storage and free up floor space. We would create a privacy screen for the bathroom area. The project worked better than I expected. With a common goal, tensions eased. People paired off in work teams, finding ways to cooperate despite the cramped conditions. By the end of day 18, our space was transformed. Still crowded, but organized in a way that made it feel more manageable. The storm continued outside, adding another 2 feet of snow. We took turns digging at the door, keeping a path open to prevent complete burial and maintaining air exchange. The work was exhausting but necessary. Without it, we risked either suffocation or the building collapsing under the snow's weight. Day 19 brought a new crisis. Our main heating system, the wood stove that had been our literal lifeline, began to fail. At first it was just smoking more than usual, sending puffs of ash back into the room. Then we noticed the metal of the stove body glowing red in places it shouldn't, indicating dangerous overheating of the metal. Henry inspected it as best he could while it was still operating. The chimney's partially blocked, he diagnosed. Snow and ice buildup. And the stove itself wasn't designed for continuous operation at these temperatures for this long. The metal is starting to warp. We faced an impossible choice: stop using the stove and freeze, or continue using it, and risk either a catastrophic fire or carbon monoxide poisoning from the increasingly poor ventilation. We need to repair it, I said, which means letting it cool down completely first. Allowing our primary heat source to go cold in temperatures hovering around -50 meant gambling with all our lives. We spent hours preparing, gathering every blanket, piece of clothing, and insulating material we had. We positioned everyone in the center of the room, planning to use shared body heat as much as possible. We would use the propane heater in short bursts, just enough to prevent freezing. As the stove cooled, the temperature in the outpost plummeted. Within 2 hours, we could see our breath inside. Within 4 hours, water was freezing in cups. We huddled together, taking turns in the middle of the group where it was warmest. Daniel and Elena, the children, remained at the center constantly, wrapped in so many layers they could barely move. Henry, Frank, and I worked on the stove in shifts, our fingers going numb despite gloves, making repairs with tools that became too cold to hold with bare skin. We dismantled the stovepipe, cleared the dangerous buildup of creosote and ice, reinforced weakened sections with metal salvaged from equipment cases, and reassembled everything. The work took nearly 9 hours. By the time we were ready to relight the stove, the interior temperature had dropped to just above 0. Sophie was treating the early stages of frostbite on several people's extremities. Everyone was shivering uncontrollably. I could see in their eyes the same fear, that we had made a fatal mistake, that the stove wouldn't work, that this would be how our story ended. When the first flames caught and held, no one cheered. We were too cold, too exhausted, too aware of how close we'd come. It took another 3 hours for the room to warm enough that people began to unfold from their huddled positions. But we had survived. The repaired stove burned cleaner, drew better, and would last longer with proper maintenance. That night, as people finally began to relax in the returning warmth, a newcomer arrived. We heard the now familiar sound of someone following the tracks, tapping metal on the rails periodically as they approached. When we opened the door, we found a young woman so covered in ice and snow she looked more like a walking sculpture than a human. We brought her inside and carefully removed her frozen outer layers. Beneath was a park ranger named Jessie, maybe mid-20s, with severe frostbite on her face and hands, but somehow still alive and conscious. As Sophie treated her frostbite, Jessie shared fragments of information between pained winces. She had been stationed at a remote monitoring post in Carson National Forest when the blue storm hit. She'd survived on stockpiled supplies for nearly 2 weeks before attempting to reach civilization. She'd been traveling for 5 days, following the railroad tracks where they crossed through the forest, sleeping in maintenance culverts and struggling to keep moving as the temperature continued to drop. What made her different from our other arrivals was the radio she carried, a high-powered emergency service model that had somehow maintained battery power despite the cold. As she recovered enough to speak more clearly, she shared what she'd heard during her journey. "There are organized evacuation zones," she confirmed, validating the fragments we'd picked up earlier. "The military has established heat centers along the southern border, using geothermal energy from natural hot springs and volcanic activity. They're collecting survivors there, trying to establish sustainable communities." "How far south?" Rebecca asked, the scientist in her immediately calculating possibilities. "Northern Mexico and the border region," Jesse replied. "Somewhere in the Chihuahuan Desert." The broadcasts mentioned Presidio specifically. This was the first concrete location we'd heard, a small border town in West Texas that straddled the Rio Grande across from Ojinaga, Mexico. It was hundreds of miles south, but connected by rail lines that ran through El Paso. "Are they sending rescue teams north?" Lucia asked, hope evident in her voice. Jesse's expression answered before her words did. "Number. They don't have the resources for long-range rescue operations. The broadcasts are clear. If you can make it south, there's refuge. If you can't, you're on your own." The news silenced the room. The existence of safe zones was both hope and heartbreak. Salvation existed, but only for those who could reach it. Given the conditions outside, the distance involved, and our limited resources, it might as well have been on another planet. That night, a new tension filled our crowded space, not the irritation of close quarters, but the weight of an impossible decision forming. Stay in our relatively stable situation with established supplies and connections to the local network, or risk everything on a dangerous journey south toward the promise of something better. No one slept much. I lay awake, listening to the repaired stove ticking as it heated, watching frost patterns form and melt on the windows in an endless cycle, thinking about what it would mean to leave the relative safety we'd established for the unknown. Outside, the wind howled with renewed strength, driving snow against the building in waves that sounded almost like the ocean. Our outpost was a tiny island in a vast white sea, and we were contemplating setting sail with no guarantee of reaching shore. By morning, the storm had intensified again. The path we'd dug to the door was completely filled in. We were truly isolated, cut off even from the tenuous connections we'd established with other survivors along the rail line. As we worked to clear the door again, I realized we were approaching a breaking point. Not just for our physical shelter, but for our community. A decision would have to be made soon, or it would be made for us by circumstances beyond our control. Days 20 through 22 were consumed by the debate about whether to stay or go. The storm finally broke, allowing us to properly dig out and assess our situation. The snow had accumulated to incredible depths, over 8 feet in some drifts against the building. The railroad tracks were completely buried in many sections, visible only as slight depressions in the uniform white landscape. "We should stay," Frank argued during our community meeting that evening. "We have shelter, supplies, connections to the local network. The journey south would be hundreds of miles through conditions that have already killed millions." "But for how long?" Miguel countered, gesturing to his children. "What kind of future are we offering them here? A maintenance shed in a frozen wasteland until supplies eventually run out." The debate split our group almost evenly. Frank, Henry, Sophie, and Ava wanted to stay, believing our best chance was maintaining what we'd built. Miguel, Lucia, Rebecca, Zach, and Jesse advocated for attempting the journey south. Martin remained undecided, weighing both arguments carefully. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of tiebreaker, all eyes turning to me whenever the discussion reached an impasse. I didn't have an easy answer. Both sides made valid points. The journey south offered hope of something better but came with enormous risks. Staying offered security in the short term but no real future. During a rare moment alone, Rebecca approached me with maps she'd been working on. "I've been plotting temperature data based on what we know and what Jesse's heard on the radio," she explained. "The cooling isn't uniform. It follows patterns related to elevation, ocean proximity, and existing weather systems. If we follow the right route south, we might find conditions gradually improving rather than hitting a sudden warm zone at the border." Her analysis was compelling but relied on limited data. Still, it was the first scientific approach to our dilemma, rather than just emotional arguments about risk versus hope. On day 21, I made a proposal to the group. "We don't have to make this an all-or-nothing decision. Some can stay, maintaining this outpost as part of the northern network. Others can attempt the journey south. If they succeed, they can send back information or possibly even help." The compromise satisfied no one completely but provided a path forward. After much discussion, the group sorted itself out. Frank, Henry, and Sophie would stay at the outpost. The rest, Miguel and his family, Rebecca, Zach, Jesse, Martin, and myself, would attempt the journey south. Once the decision was made, we turned to practical preparations. The most critical challenge was transportation. Walking hundreds of miles in these conditions was suicide. We needed vehicles that could handle deep snow and extreme cold while carrying people and supplies. The solution came from my railroad background. "There's a maintenance depot about 15 miles south," I explained, pointing to my maps. "It houses specialized vehicles including cold-weather track inspection units. They're essentially enclosed snowmobiles designed to run on or alongside tracks. If they're still there and we can get them operational, they could take us a significant portion of the journey." Martin, who had engineering experience, thought it was possible. "Those units have diesel engines modified for extreme conditions. If the fuel hasn't gelled completely and the batteries aren't dead, we might be able to get them running." The next 2 days were consumed with preparations. We inventoried every supply, dividing them fairly between those staying and those going. We modified clothing for maximum protection against the cold, adding extra layers and sealing potential gaps with anything waterproof we could find. We studied maps, plotting a route that followed the rail line south through New Mexico toward El Paso, then east along the border toward Presidio. For those staying behind, we improved the outpost's security and sustainability. Frank designed a better snow-clearing system to prevent future burials. Henry worked on making the stove and generator more fuel-efficient. Sophie organized the medical supplies, ensuring both groups would have essential items. The night before our planned departure, I found it impossible to sleep. The responsibility for leading this expedition weighed heavily. These people were trusting me with their lives based on my knowledge of the railroad system and my supposed leadership abilities. What if I was leading them to their deaths instead of salvation? I slipped outside briefly, needing space to think. The cold hit like a physical blow, making my lungs burn with each breath. Above, the sky was perfectly clear, stars shining with an intensity I'd never seen before the world froze. The aurora borealis, once rare this far south, had become a common sight, rippling green and purple curtains across the northern horizon. It was beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of how completely our planet's systems had changed. When I came back inside, I found Martin sitting by the stove, unable to sleep as well. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, careful not to wake the others. "Wondering if I'm making the right call," I admitted. "Leading people away from a secure position based on second-hand information and hope." Martin nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about railroad history. When they were building the transcontinental line, surveyors and workers pushed through territories completely unknown to them, facing blizzards, mountains, deserts. Most of them survived. Some even thrived. They had less information and worse equipment than we do. His perspective helped. Humans had faced seemingly impossible journeys throughout history and succeeded. We weren't the first to venture into hostile territory on limited information and hope. Day 22 dawned clear and cold, the temperature hovering around -40, brutal but consistent. Our departure was solemn. Those staying helped us load our supplies onto the makeshift sleds we would use until we hopefully found better transportation. Hugs were exchanged, promises to send back information if we could, quiet acknowledgments that we might never see each other again. As we prepared to leave, Frank pulled me aside. "I still think you're making a mistake," he said bluntly, "but I respect your decision. If you make it south, find a way to let us know. And if you need to come back, there will be a place for you here." It was as close to emotional as Frank ever got. I nodded, unable to find adequate words for the moment. Then I took my place at the front of our group. 8 people with sleds loaded with the supplies we hoped would sustain us across hundreds of miles of frozen wasteland. "Stay on the tracks as much as possible," I instructed them. "They're the most reliable path, even when buried. If we get separated, continue south and meet at the next mile marker. Check each other regularly for signs of frostbite. No one gets left behind." With final waves to those remaining at the outpost, we began our journey. The going was painfully slow. Even following the raised railroad bed, the snow was deep and treacherous. We established a rotation for breaking trail, the person in front switching out every 30 minutes to avoid exhaustion. By midday, we had covered only about 4 miles, far short of what we'd hoped. The cold sapped our energy faster than expected, requiring frequent brief stops to rest and warm extremities. But we continued on, each step taking us further from the security we'd established and closer to either salvation or disaster. As the short winter day began to fade, the maintenance depot I'd pinned our transportation hopes on appeared in the distance. A large metal building partially buried in snow but clearly intact. Whether it still contained the vehicles we needed, and whether they could be made operational, remained to be seen. But it was the first milestone in our journey, the first test of whether my plan had any merit. "We'll shelter there for the night," I told the group, pointing ahead, "and tomorrow we'll see if we can find a better way to continue our journey." No one complained about the slow progress or questioned the plan. We had committed to this path together, and there was no going back now. The frozen world stretched endlessly before us, and our only option was to keep moving forward, one painful step at a time. The maintenance depot loomed before us like a monolith from another age. Half buried in snow, its metal walls reflecting the dying light, it represented our first real hope for faster transport. We approached cautiously, looking for signs of other visitors or occupants, but the snow around the building was undisturbed except for animal tracks, probably foxes or coyotes seeking shelter. I used my master key to unlock the main entrance, which was partially blocked by a snowdrift. It took all of us working together to clear enough space to squeeze through. Inside was dark and freezing, but crucially, dry and protected from the wind. Martin and Zach immediately set about establishing a temporary camp while the rest of us began exploring the facility. The depot was larger than our outpost, with separate areas for equipment storage, maintenance, and administrative functions. Most importantly, it housed exactly what I'd hoped to find: 3-track inspection vehicles designed for winter conditions. They resembled enclosed snowmobiles with reinforced bodies, tank-like treads, and small heated cabins that could fit 3 people each. "Will they work?" Miguel asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I examined the vehicles carefully. They're designed for extreme cold, with special cold weather oil, insulated batteries, and fuel systems that resist gelling. But they've been sitting idle for weeks in temperatures they weren't built for. We won't know until we try. Martin, who had the most mechanical experience among us, conducted a thorough inspection. Battery terminals are corroded from the cold. Fuel has probably separated and thickened. Rubber components might be brittle, but the engines themselves should be sound. With some work, we might get them running. We decided to focus on getting just one vehicle operational first, combining parts from all three if necessary. While Martin, Zach, and I worked on the mechanics, the others established our shelter for the night. The depot had a small break room with a propane heater similar to the one we'd been using, which Rebecca managed to get working. The night passed in shifts, some sleeping while others worked on the vehicles. The cold made every task take 3 times longer than normal. Tools stuck to bare skin. Bolts were frozen in place. Battery acid had crystallized, but we persevered because we understood the stakes. On foot, our journey would take weeks we didn't have the supplies for. With motorized transport, we might reach the border in days. By dawn of day 23, we had one vehicle partially functioning. The engine would start, but ran roughly. The heating system worked intermittently. The treads moved, but needed more lubrication to operate efficiently in the extreme cold. It's not perfect, Martin admitted, but it's better than walking. We loaded our most essential supplies into the working vehicle, planning to tow some additional items on a sled behind it. The vehicle was designed for 3 people, but we modified it to carry 4 uncomfortably, Miguel and his family. The rest of us would follow its tracks on foot, rotating who got to ride when fatigue became too great. We set out mid-morning, the vehicle breaking trail and the rest of us walking in its wake. The difference was immediately apparent. Where yesterday we had managed perhaps 4 miles in a full day of exhausting travel, by noon we had already covered nearly 10 miles, with those walking benefiting enormously from the path cleared by the vehicle. Around 2 in the afternoon, we encountered our first major obstacle, a collapsed bridge over a small river. The rail line crossed what had once been a modest stream, but was now a frozen expanse about 30 feet across. The bridge had buckled, presumably from the extreme temperature changes, making it impossible to cross on the tracks. "We'll have to go around," I said, studying my maps. "There's a road crossing about a mile east of here. If the vehicle can handle the detour through deeper snow, we can rejoin the tracks on the other side." The detour cost us precious time and fuel, but we successfully navigated around the obstacle and returned to the rail line. By late afternoon, we had covered nearly 20 miles, a remarkable improvement over our previous pace. As daylight began to fade, we spotted something unexpected ahead, a military vehicle parked near the tracks. A Humvee modified for Arctic conditions, with United States Army markings clearly visible on its sides. Around it, 3 figures in white cold-weather military gear were examining the rail line. We approached cautiously, unsure whether to expect help or hostility. When they spotted us, the soldiers immediately raised weapons, not pointing directly at us, but clearly prepared for trouble. "U.S. Army," one called out as we came within speaking distance. "Identify yourselves." I stepped forward as our spokesman. "Civilians seeking evacuation south. I'm Elijah Castillo, former Union Pacific track inspector. We're trying to reach the border safe zones." The soldiers relaxed slightly but maintained their caution. Their leader, a captain named Rivera, according to his name tape, approached to speak with me while his men kept watch. "We're part of a reconnaissance unit," he explained, "assessing transportation routes for possible evacuation corridors. Not a rescue mission, I'm afraid." "We're not asking for rescue," I told him. "Just information. We've heard about safe zones near Presidio. Is that accurate? Is there really someplace warm enough to survive long term?" Captain Rivera studied me for a moment before answering. Yes, there are established safe zones along the border using geothermal heat sources. Presidio is one of them, but the journey there is extremely dangerous. We've lost multiple units trying to establish secure routes. He shared what information he could, current conditions further south, areas to avoid, potential shelter points along our planned route. In exchange, I provided details about the survivor network we'd encountered along the northern rail lines and the conditions we'd observed. Keep following the main line south, he advised. Avoid cities and towns. They've become conflict zones over remaining resources. The cold gets marginally better past Albuquerque, but it's still lethal without proper equipment. Before we parted ways, Rivera provided us with military rations from their supplies and a more detailed map than we had, marked with known hazards and potential refuge points. It wasn't the rescue we might have hoped for, but the information and supplies significantly improved our chances. We made camp that night in a small maintenance shed near where we'd encountered the military unit. The shed wasn't designed for human habitation, but its walls blocked the wind and its roof kept out the snow. We ran the vehicle's engine periodically to provide heat, careful to vent the exhaust properly. Despite the progress we'd made, morale was mixed. The confirmation of safe zones provided hope, but the captain's warnings about the dangers ahead were sobering. Additionally, our vehicle was showing signs of strain, unusual noises from the engine, intermittent electrical issues, fuel consumption higher than expected. Day 24 began with a mechanical failure. The vehicle wouldn't start, its battery drained from running the heater overnight. Martin diagnosed the problem as a failing alternator that wasn't properly recharging the battery during operation. "We need to find a replacement or a way to bypass the system," he said after examining the components. "Otherwise, we're on foot from here." I consulted my mental map of the rail line. There's a larger service center about 10 miles ahead. If we can get the vehicle working just long enough to reach it, we might find the parts we need. Using a hand-cranked emergency starter from our supplies, we managed to get the engine running again. Martin bypassed several non-essential electrical systems to reduce demand on the failing alternator. The vehicle ran roughly but moved forward, which was all we needed. The 10-mile journey took nearly 4 hours as we babied the struggling machine along. Twice it stalled completely, requiring tense minutes of repairs in the brutal cold before we could continue. Each time, I watched the anxiety grow on everyone's faces. Without this transportation, our journey would take weeks rather than days, and our supplies wouldn't last. The service center finally appeared through swirling snow, a substantial facility that served as a regional maintenance hub for the railroad. Like everything else, it was abandoned and partially buried, but its size suggested it might contain what we desperately needed. Just as we approached the facility, our vehicle gave a final mechanical shudder and died. No amount of cranking or bypassing would revive it. We were forced to continue on foot, dragging our supplies through snow that reached mid-thigh in places. Reaching the service center door was an exhausting ordeal that left everyone gasping for breath in the burning cold air. The facility was locked, but my master key again proved its worth. Inside, we found a cavernous space filled with equipment, tools, spare parts, and most surprisingly, an intact maintenance train. 3 cars, including a locomotive, sitting on an interior service track. "Could we get it running?" Zach asked, staring at the train with obvious hope. Martin examined the locomotive carefully. "It's diesel-electric, much more powerful than our little inspection vehicle, designed to operate in all weather conditions. If the fuel hasn't gelled completely and the batteries have any charge left, it's possible." We spent the remainder of day 24 assessing the train and preparing to attempt starting it the following morning. The service center provided welcome shelter, much larger than anything we'd had since leaving the original outpost. It even had separated office spaces where we could spread out slightly, a luxury after weeks of crowded conditions. That night, as the others slept, I stood looking at the maintenance train that represented our best hope for completing this journey. It seemed almost absurd, the specialized knowledge that had defined my former career now potentially the difference between life and death for these people who had become my responsibility. Outside, a full moon illuminated the frozen landscape, casting blue-white light across endless snow. In the distance, a lone wolf howled, life somehow continuing even in these impossible conditions. I wondered if the animal was alone or had a pack, if it was thriving or merely surviving, much like us. Day 25 would bring our biggest gamble yet, attempting to start and operate a maintenance train that had sat idle for weeks in temperatures that killed engines as surely as they killed people. Success would dramatically increase our chances of reaching the border. Failure would mean continuing on foot through conditions that had already claimed millions of lives. I touched the cold metal of the locomotive, feeling both dread and hope. The railroad had been my life before the world froze. Now, it might be our only path to salvation. Morning of day 25 brought both urgency and methodical patience. Starting the maintenance train would require careful preparation. Rush any step, and we might destroy our only chance. First, we needed to heat the locomotive systems enough to function. The diesel fuel had certainly gelled in the extreme cold, and attempting to start the engine with solidified fuel would damage it beyond repair. We gathered every heat source we could find: propane heaters from the service center, chemical heat packs from our supplies, even burning small amounts of materials in controlled containers. Martin directed our efforts, having the most mechanical experience. Focus heat on the fuel lines and filters first, he instructed. Then the batteries. The engine block itself is likely still okay, but the fluids are the weak point. For 6 hours we worked, slowly warming critical systems. The process was maddening in its tedium, but no one complained. We all understood the stakes. While some of us attended to the locomotive, others explored the service center more thoroughly, finding additional supplies we hadn't noticed in our initial search: winter clothing, tools, some preserved food, and, most valuable of all, communication equipment. Jessie, with her Park Service background, managed to get a radio receiver functioning. "Still can't transmit," she explained, "but we can listen." The broadcasts we picked up were sparse but information-dense: military channels discussing supply routes, emergency services coordinating limited rescue operations, sporadic civilian communications between established settlements. All confirmed what we already knew. Organized society had collapsed in most areas, but pockets of survival existed, particularly toward the south. Around mid-afternoon, Martin determined we were ready to attempt starting the locomotive. "The fuel's flowing," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "Batteries show some charge. It's now or never." I climbed into the operator's position, familiar with the basic controls from my railroad career, though I'd never actually driven a locomotive. Martin talked me through the startup sequence, everyone holding their breath as I engaged the starter. The engine turned over sluggishly once, twice, 3 times, then nothing. Dead silence that felt like a physical blow to our hopes. "Again," Martin urged. "Sometimes it takes multiple attempts when they're this cold." 3 more tries yielded the same result. Initial turning, then nothing. Our carefully warmed systems were cooling rapidly in the sub-zero temperatures of the building. If we couldn't get it started soon, we'd have to begin the heating process all over again. "One more try," I said, making adjustments Martin suggested. Everyone think warm thoughts. I engaged the starter again, and this time the engine caught with a deep, rumbling cough. Black smoke belched from the exhaust stack, the locomotive shuddered violently, and for a terrible moment I thought we'd damaged something critical. Then the engine smoothed out, settling into a steady idle that felt like the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The celebration was immediate, but brief. Getting the locomotive running was only the first step. We still needed to check the track conditions, ensure the service center doors could open, and load our supplies. Most critically, we needed to determine if the tracks south were passable or blocked by snow, debris, or structural failures. I dispatched Zach and Rebecca to check the tracks immediately outside the service center while the rest of us prepared the train. The maintenance train consisted of 3 cars: the locomotive itself, a supply car with tools and equipment, and a crew car with basic accommodations including bunks and a small kitchen area. We worked quickly, transferring our supplies to the crew car and organizing the space for our journey. The locomotive was warming the connected cars through shared heating ducts, creating the first truly comfortable environment we'd experienced since the disaster began. The temptation to simply enjoy the warmth was powerful, but we maintained our focus. Zach and Rebecca returned with mixed news. "Tracks are mostly intact," Zach reported, "but there's significant snow accumulation in several areas, some drifts nearly 6 feet deep." "The locomotive has a small plow attachment," I noted, examining the front of the engine. "Not as powerful as a dedicated snowplow, but it might be enough to clear moderate drifts. We'll have to proceed carefully." By late afternoon, we were ready to depart. The massive service center doors, designed to allow trains to enter and exit, were frozen in place and required all of us working together to force them open just enough for our train to pass through. The cold that rushed in was shocking after hours in the relative warmth of the building. I took position in the engineer's seat with Martin beside me to assist with operations I was less familiar with. The others secured themselves in the crew car as I gradually applied power, feeling the massive machine begin to move forward on the tracks. The initial acceleration was nerve-wracking, too fast, and we risked derailment on tracks potentially damaged by the extreme conditions. Too slow, and we might not have enough momentum to clear snowdrifts. Outside the service center, daylight was already fading. The short winter day was ending, but stopping now would mean losing the heat we'd built up in the engine. We decided to continue, using the locomotive's powerful headlights to illuminate the tracks ahead. The first few miles were encouraging. The plow attachment pushed aside accumulated snow effectively, and the tracks seemed to be in reasonable condition despite the extreme temperature fluctuations they'd endured. We maintained a cautious speed, everyone alert for signs of trouble ahead. Around dusk, we encountered our first serious obstacle, a section of track buried under a massive snowdrift at least 12 feet high. I reduced speed, but maintained enough momentum for the plow to dig into the drift. For several tense minutes, the locomotive struggled against the packed snow, wheels occasionally slipping before regaining traction. Finally, we broke through to clearer track beyond. As night fell completely, the temperature dropped even further, the metal of the locomotive contracting and creaking in protest. The darkness outside was absolute, except for our headlights cutting a narrow path forward and the occasional gleam of animal eyes watching our passage from the surrounding wasteland. We continued through the night, taking turns operating the locomotive and resting in the crew car. The heated interior made it possible to remove some of our layers for the first time in weeks, revealing bodies grown thin from limited food and constant cold stress. Elena and Daniel, the Morales children, fell into the deepest sleep they'd had since the disaster began. The gentle rocking of the train and consistent warmth a luxury beyond measure. By dawn of day 26, we had covered nearly 100 miles, more distance than we could have traveled in a week on foot. The landscape had changed subtly, the mountains giving way to high desert plateaus still buried under snow, but with occasionally visible rock formations breaking the white monotony. Our progress was steady until mid-morning when the locomotive began to labor on a long, gradual incline. The engine temperature rose as it strained against the gravity and continued snow resistance. Just as we crested the hill, multiple warning lights flashed on the control panel and the engine made a concerning knocking sound. "We need to stop," Martin said urgently. "Something's wrong with the cooling system." I brought the train to a careful halt on a relatively flat section of track. Martin and I climbed out to examine the engine, the cold striking us like a physical blow after hours in the heated cab. What we found was discouraging. A crack in the cooling system had caused fluid loss, and the engine was dangerously close to overheating despite the external cold. Repairs would take hours we couldn't afford to lose. Every minute stationary meant heat bleeding away from the train and our bodies. We gathered everyone to assess our situation. "We're about 10 miles from a town called Las Vegas," I explained, pointing to our position on the maps. "Not the Nevada one, a small city in northern New Mexico. There should be a proper train station there with potential parts and supplies. But going into a population center is risky," Rebecca reminded us. "The military warned us about conflict in cities." She was right, but we had little choice. The locomotive wouldn't make it much further without repairs, and continuing on foot would be returning to the slow, dangerous pace we'd worked so hard to escape. "We need to reach that station," I decided. "We'll proceed at minimal power to avoid further damage. When we get close, we'll stop and scout the situation before entering the town limits." The 10 miles to Las Vegas, New Mexico took nearly 3 hours at our reduced speed. Everyone remained tense, watching out windows for any sign of danger. As we approached the town, thin columns of smoke were visible rising from scattered locations. Evidence of human activity, though whether friendly or hostile, remained to be seen. We stopped the train about a mile outside the town proper. Martin stayed with Miguel and his family to keep the locomotive running at idle while Zach, Jesse, Rebecca, and I disembarked to scout ahead. We moved carefully along the tracks, weapons improvised from tools held ready, unsure what we would find in this once small city. The railroad cut through the eastern edge of Las Vegas, the station situated near what had been the downtown area. As we drew closer, we could see buildings with lights inside. Candles or fires, not electricity. People had survived here somehow. Whether they would welcome strangers or see us as threats to their precarious survival remained to be seen. We approached Las Vegas with extreme caution. The town appeared partially inhabited, with smoke rising from about a third of the buildings. The railroad station stood silent, no obvious activity around it, which was both encouraging and concerning. We needed parts for our locomotive, but we also needed information about conditions ahead. Drawing closer to the station, we spotted sentries posted on rooftops, civilians with hunting rifles scanning the surroundings. They spotted us quickly, raising their weapons but not firing. A voice called out across the freezing air, demanding identification. I stepped forward slowly, hands visible. "Railroad workers traveling south. Our locomotive needs repairs. We're not looking for trouble." After a tense standoff, they allowed 2 of us, Jesse and me, to approach while Rebecca and Zach remained at a distance. We were escorted to what had become the town's command center, a former hotel where several hundred survivors had organized a functioning community. Their leader was a former county sheriff named Alvarez, who recognized my railroad credentials immediately. "We've had others come through following the rail lines," he explained, "most heading south toward the border. Some succeeded, many didn't." The town was surviving on stockpiled food, hunting, and careful rationing. They'd established a perimeter defense against desperate outsiders and dangerous wildlife driven to extremes by hunger. Most importantly for us, they had a stockpile of mechanical parts salvaged from vehicles that could no longer operate in the extreme cold. "We can give you what you need to repair your locomotive," Alvarez offered, "but we want something in return. Take some of our people south with you. We have 15, including 3 children who won't survive another month here. Our supplies are running too low." It was a significant ask. 15 additional people would strain our train's capacity and resources, but refusing meant no repairs, and potentially hostile treatment from a community we'd have to pass through. "We'll take them," I agreed after brief consideration. "But they need to understand the journey remains dangerous. We can't guarantee safe arrival." By evening of day 27, we had repaired the locomotive with parts provided by the Las Vegas community. Our crew had expanded to include 15 townspeople packed into the crew car, creating cramped conditions but providing additional skills and labor. Among them was a former railroad engineer who could spell Martin and me at the controls, and a mechanic who knew diesel engines intimately. We departed Las Vegas at dawn on day 28, our train now filled to capacity with people and supplies. The townspeople had shared crucial information about the route ahead: a major track obstruction near Albuquerque where a bridge had partially collapsed, requiring a significant detour, and reports of armed groups controlling key junctions further south. The temperature had gradually moderated as we moved southward, now hovering around -20, still lethal but significantly warmer than the -50 we'd experienced further north. The snow depth had decreased as well, making our progress faster and more reliable. By midday, we reached the outskirts of Albuquerque and faced our promised obstacle. The Rio Grande Bridge had indeed partially collapsed, its eastern span crumpled into the frozen river below. We were forced to stop, consulting maps to find an alternate route. The detour would add nearly 50 miles to our journey, following a secondary line that curved west before reconnecting with the main route south. The detour took us through more isolated territory, the tracks less maintained even before the disaster. Twice we had to stop to clear debris from the rails, working in tense, exposed shifts, everyone aware of our vulnerability. During one such stop, Jesse spotted a group watching us from a distant ridge. 3 figures on horseback observing our progress but making no move to approach. "Locals?" suggested one of the Las Vegas refugees. "Probably from one of the pueblos. They've survived winters for centuries here. They're watching to see if we're threats." We completed our work and continued on, all eyes scanning the horizon for further watchers. The secondary route eventually rejoined the main line south of Albuquerque, where we encountered another survivor community controlling a critical junction. These people were different from Las Vegas, more militarized, clearly suspicious of outsiders. They had established a checkpoint on the rail line, physically blocking passage with debris that required their cooperation to clear. Their leader, a former military officer who identified himself only as Colonel, demanded payment for passage, fuel, medicine, and weapons. When we explained our mission and destination, his demeanor shifted slightly. "Presidio is real," he confirmed. "We've had radio contact. They have geothermal heat, growing operations, even limited electricity. But the last 40 miles is contested territory. Multiple groups fighting for control of the approach." He reduced his demands after negotiation, accepting medical supplies and some tools in exchange for passage and critical intelligence about the route ahead. Most valuable was confirmation that the tracks remained largely intact all the way to the border, though conditions deteriorated in the final stretch. By nightfall on day 29, we had passed through the checkpoint and were making steady progress southward. The landscape had changed dramatically. Less snow, occasional bare ground visible, temperatures that almost felt warm by comparison to what we'd endured. That night, camped in the stationary train, we could see lights in the far southern distance. Evidently, another community or checkpoint. We were getting closer to our destination, but the colonel's warnings about contested territory left everyone on edge. We established watches, taking turns monitoring our surroundings through the night. Dawn of our 30th day brought both promise and peril. The temperature had risen to just below freezing, practically tropical compared to what we'd experienced. But ahead lay the final stretch of our journey, including the dangerous approach to Presidio that multiple sources had warned about. We proceeded cautiously, weapons ready, everyone alert for signs of the territorial conflicts we'd been warned of. Around mid-morning, we spotted our first definitive evidence, a derailed train on a parallel track, its cars ransacked and burned. Recent activity, not from the initial disaster. Just as tension reached its peak, our radio crackled to life with a clear, strong transmission. Attention train approaching from the north. You are entering Presidio Safe Zone controlled territory. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. After 30 days of cold, hunger, fear, and desperate hope, we had reached the outer perimeter of what we'd been seeking. Whether it would prove to be the salvation we hoped for remained to be seen. But in that moment, hearing another human voice reaching out with authority and purpose, I allowed myself to believe that humanity would endure this new ice age, adapting and surviving as we always have when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The border community wasn't the end of our story, just the beginning of its next chapter. But that's another story, for another time.